The morning sun rose slowly over London, brushing soft golden light across the cobblestone streets near the royal palace. It was a fresh day, the kind that made tourists eager to take photos, see famous sights, and stand near the palace gates where the royal guards performed their timeless duty. People had already gathered in groups, cameras hanging from their necks, children holding parents' hands, and friends chatting excitedly in many different languages. The royal guards were already in position. Tall, proud men dressed in the traditional uniform stood at attention, their polished boots shining, their red jackets glowing in the morning light. Each guard sat astride a massive horse, the animals towering with strength and dignity. These were not ordinary horses. They were specially trained, known for their discipline, their patience, and their ability to stand calmly even in the middle of bustling crowds. Their black coats gleamed, and their tall stature made them look like creatures from another time, carrying with them a history of centuries of service. Tourists loved the sight. Cameras clicked nonstop. Some people whispered to one another about how strict the guards were. Others marveled at how still the soldiers remained, as if carved from stone. The guards' eyes stared ahead, never breaking their gaze even when children shouted or people tried to make them laugh. The horses, too, stood calmly, only shifting their weight from one hoof to another, occasionally snorting softly or flicking their tails. In the middle of the crowd, a group of young tourists pushed their way forward. They were excited, but not in the respectful way many others were. They laughed loudly, joked with one another, and pointed at the guards as if the scene were part of a game. One of them pulled out his phone, holding it close to his face to record a video. He whispered something to his friends, and they all chuckled, eyes gleaming with mischief. The horses sensed the energy. They always did. Animals, especially ones trained to serve in high-pressure places, could read the mood of the crowd. The horse nearest to the noisy tourists shifted slightly, lifting its head as if to warn them. The guard on its back tightened his grip on the reins but did not move otherwise. He was trained not to react unless the line of safety was crossed. Still, his posture grew firm, and the tension around him felt noticeable. Nearby, an elderly couple stood quietly, admiring the ceremony. They had traveled from a small village just to see this tradition. The woman whispered to her husband about how wonderful it was to witness history alive in front of them. She shook her head softly when she saw the young tourists, as if she already knew trouble was brewing. Her husband sighed and muttered under his breath that people often forget respect when chasing entertainment. Children in the crowd gazed up at the horses with wide eyes. To them, the guards looked like heroes out of storybooks, men who could protect a kingdom. Some children smiled nervously, tugging at their parents' arms, asking if they could pet the horses. The parents gently explained that the horses were working animals and should not be disturbed. Most people listened, keeping a safe distance, respecting the invisible line of order that stood between the guards and the crowd. But not everyone cared. The group of loud tourists decided they wanted to test the limits. One of them waved his hands in the air, trying to get the horse's attention. Another clapped loudly, laughing when the animal's ear flicked back. The crowd around them grew uneasy. A few people frowned, some even stepped back, not wanting to be near if something went wrong. Yet the young tourists didn't notice, or perhaps they didn't care. To them, this was just part of their fun day in the city. The horses, though, were not toys. They were living beings, powerful and sensitive, with instincts that could not be ignored. Their training was strong, but no amount of training could erase their natural reactions if pushed too far. The horse closest to the noise let out a sharp snort, its chest rising and falling faster. The guard steadied it calmly, but inside he knew it was a matter of time before discipline would be tested. A group of schoolchildren watched with serious eyes. Their teacher leaned down and reminded them quietly that the guards and horses must be respected, that these traditions were not just for show but for honor. The children nodded, understanding far more than the rowdy tourists who continued to act foolishly. The morning grew busier. More tourists arrived. More cameras lifted into the air, and the sound of chatter filled the courtyard. Yet under the surface there was a layer of unease, like the quiet before a storm. The guards remained statuesque, their faces stern, their bodies motionless. The horses stood tall, but every flick of the tail and twitch of an ear was a silent message. Patience was being tested. Still, the young tourists carried on. They began making animal noises, mocking the horses as if they were circus performers. One even pretended to neigh, doubling over with laughter when his friend caught it on video. The foolishness drew a few nervous laughs from others in the crowd, but most people turned away, embarrassed to be near such behavior. One mother pulled her young daughter closer, whispering that the guards were not to be teased, that it was dangerous to provoke an animal of such size and strength. The child nodded, clutching her small stuffed bear tightly. She looked up at the horse, her eyes filled with both fear and admiration. She seemed to sense what the grown-ups around her ignored. Respect was necessary here. The scene, though beautiful with tradition, had begun to feel strained. Every stomp of a hoof against the stone made people glance nervously. Every clink of metal from the reins sounded sharper in the air. The guards, silent but powerful, were like a wall holding back the growing disrespect of a few who didn't understand where the line was drawn. The day had started as a celebration of history, a chance for visitors to see something rare and unforgettable. But now, the balance between respect and foolishness was being tested, and the quiet dignity of the royal guards and their horses hung in the air like a fragile thread. And as the crowd pressed closer, that thread was about to snap. The morning crowd at the palace gates grew thicker as the hours passed. Tourists from many countries pressed forward, each wanting the perfect picture, the perfect memory of London's royal tradition. The guards stood tall in their red uniforms, their polished boots reflecting the sunlight, their horses gleaming like black statues of power. The guards were famous for never breaking character, for never showing emotion, and the visitors found that both fascinating and amusing. For most people, the sight inspired respect. They spoke in hushed voices, careful not to disturb the horses or the men in uniform. Families smiled for quick photos. Couples held hands and elderly travelers admired the strength of tradition that had lasted for centuries. The atmosphere was meant to be one of dignity and honor, but among the crowd a few thought of it only as a stage for their own entertainment. The small group of loud tourists from earlier grew bolder. Their phones were out, filming every step, every movement, every reaction they could stir. At first they were content to laugh and make jokes in their own circle, but slowly they began pushing the limits. They wanted more than just photos. They wanted a story to tell, something outrageous to show when they went home. One of them clapped loudly near a horse's ear again, and when the animal stomped its hoof, the group erupted in laughter. A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. Parents whispered warnings to their children, quietly pulling them back. A few people even muttered under their breath, telling the group to stop, but their voices were drowned out by the foolish noise of the tourists. The horses were not ordinary animals. They were highly trained, disciplined, and steady, yet they were still living creatures with sharp instincts. They could sense disrespect, fear, and mockery just as clearly as they could sense kindness. One of the horses began tossing its head, the reins jingling with a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the courtyard. The guard on its back shifted slightly, his gloved hand tightening on the reins. His eyes remained fixed forward, but his jaw grew firm. He had seen countless tourists behave badly over the years, but he also knew the strength of the horses. He knew that if pushed too far, even the most disciplined animal could react. The crowd began to split in two kinds of silence, one filled with awe at the beauty of the moment, and the other filled with unease, waiting for something to happen. It was as if the entire courtyard had turned into a stage, with the foolish tourists performing recklessly, while everyone else sat unwillingly as their audience. Another member of the group, a young man with a bright camera strapped across his chest, stepped closer to the guard's horse. He grinned widely, stretching his hand toward the horse's reins as though he were about to pat the animal like a friendly pet. Gasps rose from the crowd. A mother quickly pulled her child away, and even a group of teenagers from another country shook their heads, whispering warnings. The horse reacted instantly. With a loud snort, it reared its head back, shaking off the intruding hand. The sudden movement startled those nearby, making a few people stumble backward. The tourists laughed even harder, thinking they had captured the perfect moment on video. They didn't notice the guard's expression, unmoving, serious, and unyielding, but with an edge of steel in his composure. Not far away, an old man who had seen the ceremony many times before turned to his wife and sighed. "They don't understand," he said quietly. "This isn't a circus. These horses aren't here for their amusement. They're here to serve, to represent something greater." His wife nodded. sadness flickering across her face as the laughter of the tourists continued to break the air. The tension thickened. The horses were beginning to show signs of irritation, ears pinned back, tails flicking sharply, muscles twitching under their shining coats. These were warning signs for anyone who understood animals, yet the group of loud tourists either didn't see them or chose to ignore them. Meanwhile, the rest of the crowd grew restless. People were no longer only interested in taking photos of the guards. Now their eyes shifted repeatedly between the guards, the horses, and the misbehaving group. Parents whispered to their children, explaining why the guards did not move and why the horses must be respected. The lesson was clear for those who listened. Discipline is not weakness, and silence can be more powerful than words. The air grew heavier, the kind of stillness that often comes before something sudden. Even the pigeons that usually fluttered around the courtyard seemed to avoid the noisy corner where the group stood. The sound of laughter and mockery cut through the atmosphere like an unwelcome echo, bouncing against the palace walls. One tourist in the group, perhaps the boldest of them all, decided to push things further. He stepped closer, almost into the line where visitors were never supposed to cross. He made a strange noise, imitating a horse's neigh, leaning in as though daring the animal to react. The crowd's murmurs grew louder now, voices filled with unease. Some pulled out their phones, expecting something to happen. Others turned away, unwilling to watch what they sensed was about to unfold. The horse did not move at first, but its nostrils flared, and its chest rose sharply as it took in a deep breath. Its ears flicked back and its hooves shifted on the stones. The guard's grip tightened once again, his body perfectly still otherwise, his training holding him steady like an unshakable pillar. He did not look down. He did not break his gaze. Yet anyone who knew the traditions could sense that the line of patience was nearly broken. Children clung tighter to their parents' arms. Some began asking questions in nervous whispers. "Why are they doing that?" one child asked. The answer came softly from a father's lips. Because they don't understand respect, and sometimes people regret it too late. The tension in the air became almost visible, as if the entire courtyard was holding its breath. Every sound seemed sharper, the click of a camera, the shuffle of shoes, the distant chime of a clock tower. And above all of it, the restless shifting of horses, animals of great power and strength, standing under the weight of both discipline and irritation. The group of tourists, still laughing, had no idea that they were not just playing with their own fun, but playing with the edge of tradition, discipline, and danger. The moment stretched like a tight rope pulled to its limit, ready to snap with the smallest wrong step. And when that wrong step came, the crowd would never forget what they witnessed. The tension in the courtyard was now so heavy that even those who had been laughing earlier fell into quiet whispers. The horses stood tall, their black coats shining under the sun, but anyone who had been around animals knew the signs. Flared nostrils, sharp stomps of hooves, ears pinned back. These were not random movements. They were warnings, clear and strong. The royal guards remained motionless, their eyes fixed forward, their posture unshakable. It was their duty never to show emotion, never to break formation unless absolutely necessary. But even their silence seemed louder than the laughter of the foolish tourist who kept pushing boundaries. The boldest among the group stepped even closer. His friends encouraged him, cheering in low voices and holding their phones up to capture every moment. He made another silly sound, pretending to neigh, and reached his hand forward as if daring the horse to react. The animal's body tightened. The massive muscles rippled under its coat, and its tail flicked sharply like a whip in the air. Suddenly, with a deep snort, the horse stomped its hoof against the stone ground. The sound echoed like a hammer striking metal. Several people in the crowd gasped and stepped back quickly. A child began to cry softly, clutching her mother's leg in fear. The bold tourist only laughed harder, unaware of how close he had come to crossing a dangerous line. Another guard's horse, standing beside the first, shifted restlessly. The two animals seemed to sense each other's agitation, feeding on the energy that pulsed through the air. Their heads tossed slightly, reins jingling, armor clinking. The guards, disciplined as ever, steadied them with firm but calm hands. Still, their presence was like statues holding back a storm. The crowd grew divided. Some people muttered angrily, disgusted at the tourists' lack of respect. Others pulled out phones to record what they suspected would turn into an unforgettable moment. Parents pulled their children back, warning them in hushed voices never to behave that way around animals or soldiers. A teacher with a group of students whispered urgently for everyone to stay behind the line. The students nodded, their wide eyes glued to the unfolding scene. The bold tourist leaned closer, far too close. His friends whispered excitedly, urging him on. He waved his hand suddenly in front of the horse's face, and that was it. The horse reared its head, letting out a sharp, powerful snort. The sound of air rushing through its nostrils made the tourist stumble backward in surprise. The sudden reaction sent laughter through his group, but this time the laughter was weaker, nervous even. The animal's sheer size and power were beginning to register in their minds, but the lesson was not over. The horse pawed the ground, its hoof striking hard again. Its entire body shifted, and for a moment it looked as though it might rear up fully. The guard, calm and steady, pulled gently at the reins, guiding the animal back into control. Yet even that simple movement was filled with warning. The message was clear. The horse would not tolerate more foolishness. The crowd grew still. The air felt colder somehow, heavy with expectation. Even the tourists who had been filming seemed less confident. Their laughter died down, replaced by wide eyes and hesitant smiles. One of them lowered his phone slowly, glancing nervously at the guard who sat above them, silent and unblinking. Then came the breaking point. Another member of the group, perhaps trying to prove his own courage, took a step forward and shouted loudly, clapping his hands near the horse's ear. The reaction was immediate. The horse jerked its head violently, letting out a loud, guttural snort. It stepped sideways with sudden force, its iron-shod hoof slamming against the stone. The sound cracked through the courtyard like thunder. The bold tourist jumped back, his face pale now. His friends no longer laughed. Their phones shook in their hands as they realized they were no longer in control of the scene. The guard, still calm, adjusted the reins firmly and pressed his boots gently to steady the horse. His jaw tightened, but his voice never broke the silence. His discipline was absolute, but his presence carried a weight that made even the boldest tourist step back. Murmurs spread through the crowd. "They've gone too far," one man said. "They should leave now," another woman whispered. Parents held their children closer, not wanting them anywhere near the front. Even those who had been recording lowered their phones, suddenly feeling uneasy about capturing something that felt more serious than entertaining. The horses, still unsettled, shifted again. Their bodies towered over the tourists, reminding everyone that these were not simple show animals. They were working creatures, trained for strength, discipline, and service. Their power was undeniable, and their patience had limits. The tourists stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The one who had clapped near the horse's ear tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked slightly. His friends didn't join him this time. Their earlier excitement had melted into nervous silence. The guards, though silent, seemed more commanding than ever. Their stillness was not weakness, it was strength. Their presence alone spoke louder than any words could. The foolish tourist began to realize this, though far too late. One of them tried to step back quietly, but the crowd was watching now, eyes fixed on their every move. Whispers of disapproval spread quickly. "Shameful," someone muttered. "They don't know what they're playing with." Another voice, calmer but firm, said, "Respect is earned here, not demanded." The tourists exchanged uneasy glances. They had come looking for a funny video, a silly story to share online. Instead, they had found themselves standing in front of animals whose strength was far beyond their control, and guards whose silence carried the weight of centuries of tradition. The horses snorted again, tossing their heads as if to shake off the irritation. The guards steadied them once more, their discipline unbroken. But the message had been delivered. The tourists had crossed the line, and the regret was written across their faces. Around them, the crowd grew calmer, almost relieved that nothing worse had happened. Parents bent down to their children, whispering lessons about respect and behavior. The elderly couple who had been watching shook their heads, quietly saying that moments like these showed why traditions were meant to be honored, not mocked. The foolish tourists, still pale and shaken, finally lowered their phones. Their laughter had disappeared, replaced with silence. They stepped back, no longer the center of attention they had hoped to be. Instead, they had become the example, an example of what happens when respect is forgotten. And though no guard had spoken a word, and no horse had done more than react naturally, the lesson was clear to everyone in the courtyard. The courtyard was no longer filled with laughter. What began as a playful scene had now turned serious. The tourists who had mocked the horses stood awkwardly, their faces pale, their phones lowered. The sudden power of the horses and the unshaken silence of the royal guards had humbled them. The regret was heavy in the air, and everyone could feel it. The guards did not speak. They never did. Their discipline was the most powerful answer to foolishness. Their stillness showed control, but their very presence also reminded everyone of the honor they carried. Behind those red jackets and shining boots was not only ceremony but history, tradition, and service to a nation. The tourists finally began to understand this truth. Around them, the crowd slowly returned to its respectful calm. Parents whispered softly to their children, telling them that this was why they must never disturb the guards or the horses. Teachers pointed out how the guards remained still despite the trouble, showing real strength. The children nodded, wide-eyed, realizing they had witnessed something important. The foolish group of tourists shifted nervously, trying to blend back into the crowd, but eyes followed them. Everyone had seen what they did. Everyone knew they had crossed the line. A sense of shame fell over them, though no one said a word directly to them. The silence of the crowd was its own kind of judgment. The horses, though still restless, began to settle as the disturbance faded. Their flared nostrils eased, their ears slowly relaxed, and their breathing became steady again. The guards kept their hands firm on the reins, guiding the animals back into calmness with steady control. Their training had prepared them for moments exactly like this. The crowd admired it, how one simple shift of the guard's posture could calm a horse weighing hundreds of pounds. The tourists, however, now looked less like bold adventurers and more like lost children. Their earlier confidence had drained away. Their phones hung limply at their sides. One of them muttered under his breath, "Let's just go." Another nodded quickly, no longer eager for attention. They moved back from the line slowly, as if retreating would erase what had just happened. But the moment had already left its mark. The elderly couple who had been watching since the beginning exchanged a knowing look. The man whispered, "They'll remember this day, not for the video they wanted, but for the lesson they didn't expect." His wife nodded, her eyes soft but firm. "Some people only learn respect when it is forced upon them," she replied. At that moment, one of the guards finally moved. Not to speak, not to punish, but to adjust his horse and guide it back into perfect stance. The movement was small, simple, and graceful, but it carried weight. It reminded the tourists and everyone watching that the guards were always in control, no matter the disturbance. A child in the crowd asked her father why the guards didn't shout or chase the rude people away. The father smiled gently and answered, "Because they don't need to. Silence can be stronger than words. The guards already showed who has the real power here." The child thought about it and nodded slowly, understanding in her own way. The lesson spread through the courtyard like a quiet wave. People no longer whispered about the tourists, but instead spoke of the strength of the guards and the dignity of the horses. Respect returned to the air stronger than before. Cameras clicked again, but now the photos were taken with care, from the right distance, with admiration rather than mockery. The foolish tourists stood near the edge of the crowd, silent. They were no longer laughing. They had been embarrassed, not by any punishment, but by the natural reaction of the animals and the unshaken discipline of the men in uniform. In their silence, they looked smaller somehow, as if their own pride had collapsed. One of them finally sighed and whispered, "We messed up." His friends nodded, their earlier boldness gone. They did not post their videos, at least not then. The fun they expected had turned into a lesson they did not want to share. They lowered their eyes, waiting for the moment to pass, hoping people would forget. But some moments are not forgotten. They become stories told again and again. Parents would tell their children about the day foolish tourists learned a lesson. Teachers would remind their students of the importance of respect. And the tourists themselves would remember the sound of a horse's hoof striking stone, louder and more frightening than they ever imagined. As the crowd settled back into its rhythm, the palace courtyard returned to its beauty. The guards stood tall, their eyes forward, their presence unbroken. The horses stood strong, majestic once more, their coats gleaming in the sun. The tourists who had mocked them were now just shadows in the background, quietly retreating without glory. And yet, something good had come from it. The rest of the visitors left with a deeper sense of respect. They had seen tradition tested, and they had seen it stand firm. They had learned that respect was not a choice in such places. It was a requirement. Even the tourists who caused the trouble learned it, though in the hardest way. They had wanted to play with honor and power as if it were entertainment, but instead, they had been reminded that discipline and dignity are not to be mocked. They left with regret heavy in their hearts, but also with a lesson that might stay with them for the rest of their lives. The guards, of course, never spoke of it. They did not need to. Their duty continued unbroken as it always had and always would. To them, this was just another day of service, another test of discipline passed with silence and strength. The horses, too, though unsettled for a time, returned to calmness. Their breathing slowed, their ears relaxed, and their stance returned to perfect stillness. They had been challenged, but they had held their dignity, just like the men who guided them. And as the sun began to dip slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across the courtyard, the day moved on. The crowd shifted, new tourists arrived, and the ceremony of tradition carried forward as if nothing had happened. But for those who had been there, the memory would remain clear. The foolish tourists had annoyed the royal guard's horses, and in doing so, they had tested not only the patience of animals but the strength of a centuries-old tradition. Their regret had been instant, their shame unforgettable, and the lesson eternal. Respect is not something to be demanded with noise and mockery. It is something to be given freely, especially in the presence of history and honor. And so the palace gates stood firm, the guards stood tall, and the horses stood proud. Life moved on, but the story of that morning became another quiet reminder whispered among those who value respect. The sun began to sink slowly in the sky, casting a golden glow across the palace courtyard. The crowd had changed over the hours as new visitors arrived and others drifted away, but the memory of what had happened still lingered. The foolish tourists who had mocked the guards and irritated the horses stood quietly at the edge, their earlier boldness gone. They looked tired now, weighed down by the weight of their own actions. The royal guards remained in perfect formation. Their red coats caught the late sunlight, glowing like fire against the gray stone walls. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes forward, their bodies steady as ever. To most people in the courtyard, they appeared almost unreal, living statues that carried both power and discipline. And yet everyone knew they were real men, each one holding back the strength of the mighty horse beneath him, each one trained to embody dignity no matter the circumstance. The horses, too, had returned to calmness. Their coats shone, their breathing was steady again, and their powerful bodies stood proudly as though nothing had happened. Only a faint flick of the tail or twitch of an ear showed that they remembered the irritation earlier. Their presence was a reminder of patience but also of strength that should never be underestimated. The crowd around them began to talk in low voices again, though the tone was different from earlier in the day. Before there had been laughter, noise, and foolishness. Now there was all respect and quiet reflection. Parents knelt beside their children, explaining why the guards deserved silence. Teachers reminded their students that history is not just in books, but also in the traditions people keep alive. Older visitors smiled softly, saying they had just witnessed a lesson no classroom could ever teach. And in the middle of this new calm, the foolish tourists felt smaller than ever. They had come hoping to create a funny memory, something to post online, a story to share for likes and comments, but instead they had become an example of shame. They were no longer the center of attention in the way they wanted. Now they were simply a reminder to others of how not to behave. One of them whispered, "Let's leave." His voice was low, filled with regret. Another nodded, shoving his phone into his pocket. Their earlier excitement was gone, replaced by silence that weighed heavily on their shoulders. As they walked slowly away from the front line, people parted to let them pass. No one clapped, no one cheered. Instead, eyes followed them with quiet judgment. For those tourists, each step away from the palace gates felt longer than the last. The sound of the horses' hooves striking the stone still echoed in their minds. The sight of the guards' unshaken faces burned in their memory. They had thought they were in control, but the truth was clear. They had never been in control at all. Respect belonged to the guards, to the horses, and to the tradition that had stood for centuries. An elderly woman who had watched everything leaned on her cane and shook her head. "They will never forget this day," she told her grandson beside her. Sometimes life teaches us lessons in ways that make us uncomfortable, but that is how we grow. The boy nodded, staring at the tall horses with wide eyes. He whispered softly, "I'll never make fun of them." His grandmother smiled. "Good. That's the right lesson." The afternoon light deepened into shades of orange, and the ceremony of the guards continued as if nothing had happened. Their movements were precise, their discipline unbroken. New tourists arrived and gasped at the sight, but they did not see the earlier disturbance. They only saw the beauty of tradition, the strength of the horses, and the silent pride of the guards. Yet those who had witnessed everything carried it with them. They told the story quietly to their companions, repeating how the horses had reacted, how the guards had stood firm, how the foolish tourists had been silenced. Each retelling carried a lesson, passed on like a whisper of wisdom. Respect the moment, respect tradition, respect those who serve. Meanwhile, the group of tourists who had caused the trouble walked away from the palace. They no longer laughed. Their regret was heavy, and though they said little to each other, each one felt the same embarrassment. They had been humbled in front of strangers, reminded that not everything in life is a game or a joke. One of them thought about posting the video he had taken but stopped himself. Watching it again, he didn't see humor. He saw himself acting foolishly, ignoring the signs of the horse's discomfort, ignoring the respect owed to the guards. He closed his phone quietly and tucked it away, knowing the memory would stay with him without needing to be shared. Back at the palace, the crowd grew calm once more. The silence around the guards was now filled not with tension but with admiration. People stood taller, spoke softer, and looked at the horses with new appreciation. Even the children seemed to understand, holding their parents' hands a little tighter, their eyes wide with wonder. The royal guards did not need to speak. They had delivered their message without words, without breaking formation, without raising their voices. The horses had spoken too, with the stomp of a hoof and the flare of their nostrils. Together, they reminded everyone that respect is not a game, and tradition is not to be mocked. As the sun finally began to dip lower, painting the sky in soft pinks and purples, the day slowly came to an end. Tourists continued to take photos, but now each click of a camera carried more meaning. Each image captured not only the beauty of the guards and their horses, but also the weight of the moment that had unfolded earlier. For the foolish tourists, regret had been instant. For the rest of the crowd, the lesson would last much longer. They had seen respect tested and restored. They had witnessed strength not in loud voices or angry words, but in silence, patience, and dignity. And as the palace courtyard slowly emptied, the story remained in the hearts of those who had been there. Some would tell it to their families back home. Others would share it quietly with friends. Parents would repeat it to their children as a reminder of how to behave. And the foolish tourists themselves would carry it as a memory they could never quite escape. The palace gate stood tall, the guards stood firm, and the horses stood proud. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The day was just another in the long history of the royal guards. But for those who had seen the foolishness and the regret, it was unforgettable. And so the story closed not with anger or punishment, but with silence, dignity, and the weight of respect. The lesson was clear, etched forever in the memory of all who had been there. Foolishness fades quickly, but respect lasts forever.